Get started a little late. I'm going to probably run a little quicker through the material, but you won't miss anything, I assure you. The agenda is starting with an introductory look at fraud through a statistical looking glass, if you will, to give us some backdrop on just how serious the fraud threat is in general and the travel and entertainment expense reimbursement fraud problem in specific. Then we'll talk about the specific major threats to organizations in the area of T&E, and we'll address briefly some of the risks, fraud risks involved with P cards, if you are involved in those to any extent. Then we'll change our track to the detection and prevention of these types of fraud, starting with the red flags of fraud, ways to detect those red flags more efficiently, and finally a rundown of the best practices that have been developed for minimizing exposure to these serious frauds. So without further delay, I want to share these statistics with you. Most of these, as you can see, come from the ACFE, which is the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners. For anyone unfamiliar with that organization, it is a prominent professional association. They do a lot of research, including the conclusion that $3.5 trillion is lost to fraud globally every year. This represents an approximately 5% of gross global product, and that 5% figure can be extrapolated down to the individual organization, so that, in other words, the typical or the average organization, and I'm sure yours are not average, would be losing approximately 5% of its gross revenue on an annual basis. Now, most, or many at least, organizations lose considerably less than that. Some lose more, and it all comes out in the wash at the end of the day at 5%. The good news here is that 5% has been the number for about 6 to 7 years now, and that is for those of us who look at this with a glass half full perspective, a good thing because it hasn't gone up. It'd be nice to see it go down, but we are still waiting on that. The average cost per incident of fraud, not just travel and entertainment fraud, but all frauds. The ACFE tracks and monitors and researches 65 plus different types of fraud, of which T&E is one. The average incident is $160,000. It's a lot less, as you can see, for expense reimbursement, where the median loss is $26,000. That may sound high to you when you consider that the lion's share of most T&E frauds are pretty small dollar thefts, phony receipts for ground transportation on a business trip, meals at fast food restaurants, and that. But on the other end, which brings the number up to this $26,000 figure, is the considerable expense made by travelers at the senior management and executive level. There, when it comes to booking business class and first class airfare, especially international airfare, and booking reservations at 5-star hotels and expensive overseas cities, and so forth and so on. That drags the average cost per expense event way up to into the $30,000 range. T&E spending is around almost $200 billion. That's according to JP Morgan Chase. And particularly important for today's presentation is Kroll, the international investigation firm, reporting to us that 67% of corporate fraud is committed by insiders. That's a bit of a startling number. Over 2/3 of all fraud, and that certainly definitely includes T&E expense reimbursement, is committed by insiders. In fact, in T&E, it's probably closer to 90 or 95%, even though there are some collusive arrangements which would involve external collaborators. But the vast majority of T&E frauds are obviously committed by people who work in the organization. So with that, let's take a closer look at who is likeliest within a typical, if there is such thing, a typical organization. In the area of accounting, the ACFE tells us, for example, you can barely see it here, unfortunately, but it is evident that the expense reimbursement fraud is way down on the list of most commonly committed frauds in the accounting area. That's not surprising, obviously, since most accounting employees do not need to travel for business. They don't have any great need for the most part, except perhaps for the accounting manager, to entertain clients or expected clients or that sort of thing. So we're not surprised that expense reimbursement fraud is lower on the list of most commonly committed frauds in that area. The opposite is in effect for the operations area in most organizations. There, expense reimbursement comes in number 3 after corruption and billing, and that's also not surprising in the sense that in the area of operations, there is a greater need in most organizations for senior managers to travel for business, either to remote locations of the same organization or to professional conferences and other events, et cetera, et cetera. So that's why you have a greater incidence of T&E fraud in the operations area, the same in sales, and that also is unsurprising given that many, if not most, sales employees do have to travel considerably for business, so you would expect there the opportunities to commit T&E fraud are very much more concentrated in the sales area than would be the case in most, if not, most other departments, functions of most organizations. And then finally, executive and upper management. This is all slightly disconcerting because we see here that one of the favorite types of fraud to be committed by senior executives, the people who are supposed to be setting the example in the organization, expense reimbursement fraud for them comes in number 3 in terms of incidence. So that's a little disheartening, but it is the reality, and these statistics are obviously valuable to us, and particularly auditors in terms of having a better idea as to where to look for T&E frauds within an organization without wasting more time than necessary. The big picture in travel and entertainment fraud, and this will sort of set the backdrop for the specific types of travel and entertainment fraud schemes, is that anyone who travels, and that includes anyone in sales all the way up to the CEO, for that matter, who travels for company business or entertains clients, typically has some opportunity to do one or more of the following general fraudulent things: pad or misrepresent expenses, which is probably the most common form of T&E expense reimbursement fraud. It has a variety of different flavors and the colors, and we'll show you some of those in a moment. There's also opportunity to manipulate itineraries. So, for example, as we'll see shortly, tacking on personal time at desirable locations where there's not fancy beaches and that sort of thing at the company's expense, and then abusing corporate credit cards and P cards is one of the older tricks in the book. It's also important to keep in mind as we round out this sort of general picture of the backdrop of T&E fraud. It is one of the favorite types of fraud committed by employees here we're talking about across the board, not just in sales or not just at the senior management level, but across the board. T&E is a favored target of employees, and we know that because the ACFE tells us that 14.5% of all fraud schemes are T&E related. Now, that may not seem like an awfully large percentage number to you at face value, but consider this. This ACFE tracks and monitors 65 plus different types of fraud on a regular basis. That means that T&E is one of those 65 different types of fraud, and it represents on its own a fully 14.5%, almost 15% of all fraud. So that shows you that this is a very popular, commonly committed type of fraud. Employees are motivated to commit these frauds, and this to some extent explains why T&E fraud is so popular amongst traveling employees. They feel that a lot of people who commit this kind of fraud feel that they deserve a little extra. They're being asked to be away from their home and their families for extended periods of time. They're being inconvenienced by the inefficiencies of air travel and so forth and so on. And they just feel like, if there's an opportunity to obtain or misappropriate a few dollars here and there while they're on a business trip, they will be justified in doing so. Obviously, those who make a living fighting fraud would disagree with that attitude, but that's a different story. So here we go into the main types of travel and entertainment fraud. We're starting with a category that we call generic schemes because they are a variety of different types of T&E fraud, but they don't fit neatly into any of the main categories such as business meals, business travel, those sorts of things, which we will get to in a moment. So before we get to those, we want to avoid overlooking these important generic schemes such as submitting expense reimbursement claims twice. So this is a fairly common incident where somebody who has returned from a business trip and is filling out their expense reimbursement claim form and attaching to it all of the required paperwork, primarily receipts and other documents that would be explanatory as to the expenses that were incurred during this business trip. This is a fraud committed by people who know that after they've submitted their expense reimbursement claim, their legitimate claim, to their immediate manager, who is typically the one required or expected to review and approve and sign off on the claim so that accounts payable can process it and reimburse the employee, this employee knows that that manager is way overworked, that, reviewing expense reimbursement documentation is way down the list of his or her priorities. So in most cases, they are going to basically sort of rubber stamp expense reimbursement claim forms, and that's why it is easy for a lot of employees to get away with submitting the same exact documentation and claim form, even though it may be in photocopy form, to that manager 2 or 3 or 6 weeks after the original legitimate one was submitted, fully expecting that this won't be noticed by the manager and it'll be approved along with all the other expense claims as a matter of normal activity. So falsifying travel and entertainment-related receipts is, again, one of the most common and often, as I mentioned earlier, one of the most low-dollar amount type frauds. If an employee is using cash to, for example, pay for a taxi cab ride from an airport to a hotel and requests that the taxi driver provide them with a blank receipt so that it can be filled out, they will take that opportunity to fraudulently inflate the amount that was actually paid for the taxi trip. And the same applies to many receipts for business-related meals or meals consumed in the course of business trips. where, in fact, personal meals are charged to the company and disguised as business-related. This happens in situations which are very common, as you probably know, where an employee is required to travel to a location where they have friends or family, and they meet up with those folks and have a meal with them, and they charge it to the company even though it's a personal expense. Over-purchasing, so booking business class air travel, but then actually submitting that business travel ticket, the air travel ticket, back to the airline, but expensing for it, yet taking an economy class seat and thereby generating a nice little windfall. Especially, as I said again, on international trips where the cost of business class airfare is pretty exorbitant. Making personal purchases, if your organization has, as it probably does, a policy where any business-related, travel-related expenses over a certain threshold amount require specific approval, you may find that there may be a pattern of transactions just under that amount, and those would be a red flag of probable personal expenses being taken against company policy. Which brings us to a real-life example of T&E fraud, and this happens perhaps more frequently than we might expect. This is a situation, this is a recounting of a real-life example, although the names have been changed. In this situation, an executive or a senior manager books a business trip, but never takes that trip, but they nonetheless create false documentation, false receipts, and false air travel documentation, oftentimes from a previous trip that they may have legitimately taken. And their plan is that when the period of time that they have indicated they will be away on business has arrived, they will subsequently submit these phony receipts and a claim to their manager and expect reimbursement, even though they never left the office. And that was a problem in the case of Jim, pictured at the right here, who actually happened to be spotted in the morning walking his adorable daughter to school one morning on a day when his coworkers were given to believe that he was in a far-off, distant European business location, and so Jim had to think pretty quickly on his feet, make up some bogus excuse about how the trip was canceled at the last minute, and these kinds of excuses are either believed or they're not, depending on the culture of the organization. In any case, the attempt, it's probably more often that somebody does not get caught committing this fraud than they do. It just so happens that Jim was unlucky in that somebody he works with happened to spot him at the time when he was supposed to be away. Now this brings us to the more sort of hard and fast categories of T&E fraud, of which business meals are the most numerous in terms of the variety of different types of fraud schemes. So they would have, for example, someone else paying for a business meal but giving the receipt to someone who wasn't even in attendance at the business meal. This is done in some cases by employees who have expense accounts and are authorized to organize and pay for or have paid for business events, lunches, dinners, that sort of thing. And they may do this, they may give the receipt to somebody they know who is having financial difficulties, or they may give it to someone and split the the proceeds with them or something to that effect. It's not that hard to do in a climate in which, a business climate in which internal controls are especially lax. Then we have submission of phony credit card receipts, probably the oldest trick in the book. As long as credit cards have been around, certainly. This is sometimes, it's kind of difficult to reproduce, although it's easier these days given, the sophistication of computer software, particularly graphic software, where you can actually fairly effectively reproduce a legitimate looking receipt that is a bogus one in reality. Nonetheless, it's still, for the average employee who's not, super proficient in Photoshop or something like it, it is hard to reproduce a legitimate looking receipt. So what happens instead is that an employee who has an expense account, a fairly generous expense account, and is entitled to entertain clients or prospective clients or business partners and others at business meals such as breakfast or lunch, typically, sometimes business dinners. They will at times develop a favorite restaurant that they take their clients to, or the people they entertain to, for lunch or dinner, whatever it happens to be. Over time, they develop a more informal, friendly relationship with the restaurant owner or manager, or sometimes they're one and the same. And as time goes on and this relationship becomes more and more cordial, it eventually comes up that, it would be easy to get away with a scheme whereby the restaurant owner, who has control over the financial transactions and people paying their bills and running credit card receipts, could run a phony receipt, a phony credit card receipt through the POS system, so give it to the employee, and who would then submit it for reimbursement, and then it would split the proceeds, whether it's 50-50, 60-40, whatever they agree on. So that can happen in situations, again, where you have an employee patronizing a specific eating establishment on a regular basis. Submitting tear chits. Now, this is fortunately one area of T&E fraud that is declining in frequency, mainly because of the developing sophistication of restaurant industry-related technology, so that most and the declining popularity of using cash for payment of business-related meals. It used to be, however, and still is to some extent, which is why we have it on the list here, that in some less formal eating establishments, the server that is taking care of a business, a party of whatever, 2 or 3 or 5, whatever it is, it takes the order on a check form. It's typically a 3.5 by 6 inch type paper form, and it's handwritten. The order is handwritten, and at the end of the meal, the amount is totaled up, and the bill is handed to whoever is responsible for paying for it. Along with that check, with that paper check, in most cases will be a perforated chit at the bottom of the form. That is usually left blank by the server or the cash register attendant, and that enables the employee, if they so desire, to falsely inflate the amount of the meal that they actually paid for. Again, you may not be talking about huge amounts of dollars here, but it's something that can happen, and if it is an organization, an eating establishment that continues to use this type of form for taking orders, it's not unlikely that the person, and once they discover how easy it is to falsify and submit for reimbursement, those phony chips, they make, patronize that organization more frequently than otherwise. Buying extra meals to take home, that is, a personal theft, again, not huge amounts, but part of the point here, and you'll hear me repeat this as we progress through this, even though these are relatively small dollar amounts, you're going to find that if they go unattended, if they go unnoticed, or they're considered too small amounts to be, acted upon in a punitive way or an investigate, you're not going to investigate, a $25, suspected fraud for, a meal that was a business meal. The point here is that in many organizations, management will not bother to allot resources to do something about these small dollar amount thefts, and that in itself inadvertently sends a message to other employees that it's okay to steal this way. Misrepresenting personal meals as business meals, so we alluded to that briefly before, but this again is one of the most common forms of, an employee taking a little bit extra because they deserve it, and that's the way that works. Adding the gratuity, even though it's already been included in the bill, and that would obviously falsely inflate the amount that's reimbursed. Purchasing meals for others when food is ordered in, even though others are, these others are not partaking in the business activity involved here. And then rounding up cash expenses. If you do use cash in the minority of instances you do use cash, you may add the gratuity and make it an even amount, which again, it has the effect of inflating the total fraudulently. Let's take a look now at hotels. Hotels obviously are going to be another fairly common area in which T&E fraud occurs. One would expect, just to create some context for you, that meal-related business T&E fraud schemes would be more numerous than hotels, and simply because a lot of fraudulent business meals are filed for at the home office. There is no travel involved. In a hotel scheme where travel is involved, some of the tricks that have been mastered by dishonest employees include scanning the hotel invoice, or hotel folio as it's called in the business, and altering the amounts. And here again, the convenience and magical powers of today's software enable employees to do this, and it's also effective in the second item on this screen, using hotel letterhead to type up a bogus bill completely for receipt with their own dollar amounts on it. And this is again, a situation in which relatively user-friendly computer software can be used either with hotel letterhead or, given the gradual disappearance of letterhead in the hotel industry, since nobody really writes letters anymore, they use email, it's nonetheless just almost as easy for an employee with modest computer skills to download the logo of the hotel that they stayed in, write the address, type in the address, the phone number, the email address, the website address, so forth and so on, and then create an invoice from scratch with an amount that happens to be, in some cases, 2 or 3 times what they actually paid. Then we have something that's really kind of sneaky, but unfortunately doesn't happen all that often, but it involves, again, sort of frequent flyer type of situation where an employee stays at, instead of it being a restaurant as we discussed in the previous slide, in this case the employee is staying at the same hotel on a repeated basis, and in the course of that ongoing relationship through repeated at the ship, with the manager of the hotel, who, if they stay long enough, because there is a very high rate of turnover in the hospitality industry, but that's an aside. Nonetheless, if the manager is there long enough to develop a relationship, a cordial relationship with this particular employee who's frequently staying there, the employee will feel comfortable in requesting that the manager provide his employer with a discount for all future stays. Now, there isn't a manager in the business, I suspect, who would deny that request, because after all, frequent flyers and loyal customers are gold to most consumer business establishments, and that includes hotels. So what happens here is the manager says, of course, we'd be delighted to offer your organization a 15% discount for all future stays. The employee says, expresses his or her sincere gratitude for that, and asks, oh, by the way, would you mind if we applied that 15% discount to the stay that I'm just checking out from today? And of course the manager says no problem, and then the employee very artfully requests that the 15% refund credit be applied to his or her personal credit card, as opposed to the corporate credit card, which was used to secure the reservation in the first place. So there you have, again, a relatively, unless you're talking about a hotel which costs, $700 or $800 a night, and you're staying there for 3 or 4 or 6 nights, the real actual windfall from this is not going to be huge. But again, you don't want to allow this to continue, because others will get wind of it and they'll start doing the same thing. Before you know it, you end up with big dollar losses, including out-of-policy charges in hotel reimbursement claims. Out-of-policy expenses include things like in-room pay-per-view movies. They include alcoholic beverages. Most organizations will not reimburse their traveling employees for alcoholic beverages consumed while on a business-related travel trip. So if employees do add these to these disallowed expenses to their expense reimbursement claim, they will be doing that, again, with the expectation that the person supposedly reviewing the claim for approval will not scrutinize every single expense in the paperwork that's submitted, and they'll get away with it. In some cases, employees are unlucky, and there is, in fact, a true story of a woman who traveled very frequently for her organization, with whom she had been an employee for several years, and she was, she decided that she, had paid her dues, if you will, having traveled, sacrificed a lot of time on the road, and there was a movie on pay-per-view at the hotel she was staying in that she really wanted to see, and she said, what the heck, they're not going to notice this $10 expense anyway, I'm just going to go ahead and do it, besides I deserve it. Well, as it happened, somebody did happen to notice in the course of reviewing her expenses that this movie was ordered and expensed to the organization, and management, in a rather, should we say, distinct and emphatic way of sending a message, fired this woman. And again, they weren't concerned, obviously, with the $10 expense. They were concerned about other employees doing the same thing and beginning to add up, to significant dollars. So that it usually won't happen, but this particular management team decided, we're not going to have it. Zero tolerance here. We're going to, walk the talk. Now, there's another a bunch of sort of miscellaneous T&E schemes, and I will tell you that it's, what I've shared with you and what I'm about to, finish sharing with you in terms of the different types of T&E and entertainment frauds. there are new ones popping up all the time, or variations on existing ones popping up all the time, again, to a large degree driven by the ever-improving technology in software that enables employees to more effectively commit these frauds. So there are a few here that are sort of fall outside the categories of hotel or meals, but are nonetheless useful to keep in mind in terms of the way in which employees think sometimes when they have their minds set on committing a fraud in an environment of inadequate control. So here was a case study where Susan, a senior vice president of sales at a large company, had along with people, other executives at her level, the authority in accordance with a policy of the senior management to send gifts to their best clients and customers at holiday season. This was a new policy that was very well received because it was, it's a very generous thing to say, the company is going to allow you to have us send to your best clients, in this case it was I think an $85 pair of crystal candlesticks, and you can, further express the organization's gratitude for their business by doing this. The way in which this particular company executed this plan was they had an admin submit basic forms to everyone who was entitled to take advantage of this policy, requesting that the names and home addresses of the recipients that they wanted to send the gifts to be added and then submitted to the admin for processing. As it turns out, the other element of the policy was that all the gifts that were ordered by individual senior level employees were to be charged to the employee's P card, so that it would sort of, in theory at least, streamline the paperwork involved with that. So what happened in short was Susan added to her list of gift recipients all of her top clients and customers, and she added along with those legitimate orders the names and a post office box address of members of her family, names of several of her neighbors and other personal acquaintances, and they all were to receive these candlesticks at the same post office box address, which in and of itself became the red flag that ultimately got her busted. Because when you see that the same person, that different people are using the same post office box address, that raises red flags right there and will eventually result in, hopefully, unless you really are not paying attention, will result in apprehension. So that's what happened in that case. It's, again, kind of an oddball situation, but one in which, again, it explains the way in which dishonest employees think in terms of exploiting weaknesses in the travel and entertainment expense reimbursement area. Very briefly on P cards. If you use P cards, it may surprise you to know, because it's counterintuitive, that most P card frauds are actually perpetrated by external parties. They're not, while it used to be in the pre-cyber days that most P card frauds were committed by cardholders, now it's the statistical fact that the majority of P card related frauds are committed by outsiders. And the reason is this. You all know about the massive hacking attacks that have resulted in misappropriation of tens and sometimes hundreds of millions of consumer credit card records from large retail chains like Target, Walmart, Home Depot, and any number of other organizations. Amongst those millions, multi-millions of credit card records stolen are inevitably a certain number of P-card records. And if the perpetrator of this hacking attack decides to use one or more of these stolen P-card records to make fraudulent purchases, then that's going to end up showing up on the legitimate P-card account holders' statements as fraudulent transactions. And that is what has become increasingly frequent in recent years as the incidence of these illegal external cyber attacks has increased. Other P-card related frauds, however, include making unauthorized purchases for personal use, as we mentioned. These are P-card frauds that aren't external but are committed by internal parties. Purchasing more than is needed by the organization and selling excess for personal financial windfalls. Disguising personal purchases as business expenses. That's similar to the way in which business meals are sometimes disguised as business expenses when they're really personal ones. And then making purchases outside of what we call the MCC code guidelines. These are merchant category codes. You may be familiar with them. If you're not, very briefly, these are codes developed by MasterCard and Visa. There are literally tens of thousands of individual codes. They are applied to specific types of business. For example, the retail florist business, for example, will have its own MCC code, as will local bakeries have their own MCC code, as will local steel makers and industrial parts makers will all have individual MCC codes. And organizations sometimes try and successfully try to control fraud by limiting the number of MCC codes that P-card holders can legitimately use, and ensuring electronically that any attempted purchases at sellers with unapproved MCC codes are declined. And then there is, we have to mention, even though we don't have a whole lot of extra time, but it is important to mention the famous, infamous Walmart P-card fraud. This was one of the more colorful events in the world of fraud generally, not just P-cards. It was committed by Tom Coughlin, who was the co-founder and co-CEO with Sam Walton of Walmart stores. So Tom Coughlin was, and this is important, by the way, for when you try to analyze and discover the likelihood that fraud could occur, there is a trust factor that many fraudsters exploit in their organizations to commit fraud without being detected. And that's, Tom Coughlin was an extreme example of this, because obviously Tom Coughlin was trusted by everyone since he was the #2 guy at Walmart, and obviously this gentleman would never do anything to hurt the company, would never do anything illegal. Besides, he was making $4 to $5 million in base salary, plus bonuses, plus benefits. So he really, in theory, you would think, logically, not have any reason to commit fraud. But for some psychological reason, Tom Coughlin found it incumbent upon himself to use his P-card to make personal purchases of alcoholic beverages, high-end catering services and food. He spent $25,000 on his P-card to entertain a group of his buddies at a weekend hunting lodge. He spent $5,000 to purchase a pair of alligator cowboy boots. By the time he finally got caught after several years, and again, these folks with the trust factor in in the works are least likely to be suspected of committing fraud. So it was quite a number of years until it was finally discovered that Tom was actually stealing big dollar amounts from the company, and it was a total of $500,000 by the time he got caught. He did plead guilty and was sentenced to house arrest. This brings us to the red flags, which I have alluded to briefly along the way. The red flags of T&E fraud, these are your keys to the kingdom, if you will. If you can identify the red flags of the various types of T&E fraud, you are way ahead of the game in terms of detection and prevention. Be aware, however, that red flags, which I will share with you in a minute, are not always indicators of, in this case, T&E fraud. They may be indicators of an honest error or an unexpected glitch in the supply system or in demand for business travel due to an increase in business activity. And I'll explain this in detail as we move along here. It's also important to know that the red flags are exceedingly valuable in a fraud prevention context because they can be used by your internal audit or compliance folks to adjust the audit plan to include specific tests and methodologies to look for specific red flags of possible T&E fraud. This can be, to a large degree, automated with audit software, which I'll explain to you in more detail, but keep it in mind for now. And then finally, red flags are essential in terms of training employees. All employees, whether they travel for business, they entertain for business, or they don't, should be trained in what the red flags of T&E expense reimbursement fraud look like. There are no, as you know, no secrets in most organizations. If somebody is, falsifying their expense reimbursement claims, eventually, somebody who works closely with that individual is going to find out. Whether they're going to share that information as a tip to management is unknown, but that is the reason why we want to train these folks, so that they are in a position to be able to share tips about other people's suspicious activity with management. Not always as easy as it sounds, but very critical to fraud prevention and detection. The red flags come in two different forms. One are the soft red flags, behavioral indicators, like the ones you see on the screen now, and they include things like, an employee suddenly is showing up to work in a $90,000 Mercedes-Benz, even though you know that their base salary is only in the mid-30,000s. They're wearing expensive designer clothes and fancy jewelry, and when confronted about these, lavish expenditures, the employee may say, well, I just won the lottery, believe it or not. Or a close relative of mine recently passed away and left me a sizable inheritance, and I'm enjoying the fruits of that. Or the reality may be that this employee is engaged in a variety of different T&E frauds schemes, as well as other non-T&E type fraud schemes. They may be a fundamentally dishonest employee that you need to find out what's really going on with this employee. All of these behavioral indicators, by the way, are, again, they either show they are indicators of fraud or they're indicators of something legitimate. As I just described, if this employee did in fact win the lottery, chances are, he or she is going to go out and buy an expensive car, among other things. But if they're stealing from the organization through their T&E privileges or other schemes, that's a different story. So we need to take a look at the red flag and then very discreetly keep an eye on this individual's conduct and behavior at the organization to see if there's any additional suspicious activity that would give us reason to look toward doing a full-fledged fraud investigation. The same applies with sudden mood changes. If you have somebody in, say, head of operations or the senior executive in sales, and that person is a very outgoing, very personable people person, people who work for or with him or her love doing so, love coming to work. This person, has a great sense of humor, enjoys socializing with people who work with him or her, or for him or her, socializing with, at lunches and dinners and, at weekend events and that sort of thing. Suddenly one day you see that this particular, normally gregarious, vivacious individual is holed up in their office with the door closed, the lights out, their head buried in the computer screen, and you wonder what in the heck is going on. Well, somebody, again, is going to need to confront this employee because this shift, this dramatic, overnight, literally overnight shift in behavior is too conspicuous to go unaddressed. So here, whether it's an immediate supervisor, whoever it is, who does the confronting, may get a response from that employee to the effect that, well, I was at the doctor's last evening, and I got some really devastating medical news about a condition that I have, and I'm trying to just deal with that. It threw me for a loop, and I'm really trying to deal with that. Or, my wife got some devastating medical news from her doctor, and we are, pretty much overwhelmed with that, and we're trying to figure out how to deal with that. Or, he or she may say that, I just got through with a 3-year-long custody battle after my divorce, and received the bill from my lawyer, and I haven't got a clue how I'm going to pay that, that immense amount of money. So all that stuff may be true, but what may also alternatively be the truth is that this employee has gotten him or herself into financial trouble through something like gambling or substance abuse or addiction, and they are desperate to find out a way to dig out of this financial hole, and that's what they're doing. They're sitting there figuring out a way to bend the rules in their favor so that they can generate funds to get themselves dug out of this financial hole. Unusual generosity. So people who successfully steal from the organization, be it through T&E or many other different types of fraud, tend to be very generous with gifts and favors with the proceeds of the frauds that they're committing. So I mentioned just in passing, the use of drugs and alcohol. Well, those, again, and gambling can get someone into trouble pretty quickly and pretty steeply, and that will generate an incentive to commit fraud. And then reluctance to take vacation or sick days. Now, this may be, again, a situation where somebody, if accounts payable, for example, is responsible for processing all of your T&E expense reimbursement claims, they may be engaged in a collusive fraudulent arrangement with one or more employees with T&E privileges, where they will collude, they will agree to falsify documents submitted for reimbursement so that there is a windfall generated by the submission of these claims. And to take vacation or sick days is because they don't want to take a risk of somebody rifling through their hard drive and finding incriminating data from this collusive T&E scheme that would potentially result in questions being asked that he or she does not want to have asked for obvious reasons. Now, the more tangible sort of specific red flags of T&E and P-card fraud are photocopies are being submitted for reimbursement rather than the original receipt. Sometimes an employee will say, well, I'm sorry, I lost the receipt, so, you know, I'm using a photocopy of the previous one, and this is, you know, actual amount spent on this. This is usually unacceptable under most organizations' reimbursement policies, but you know, some organizations' internal controls are not vigorous enough to put a stop to that. Sudden or unusual frequent business trips are recorded. So these may not be all legitimate business trips. Some of these may be trips to, you know, resort locations and that sort of thing, and being disguised as business trips. Travel on weekends. Now, it's unusual, with the possible rare exception of a long-distance overseas business trip, that somebody would need to fly out on a Saturday or Sunday. If you're traveling from New York to, say, Beijing, it may be that you do actually start your seemingly endless journey on a Sunday afternoon, because it's going to be essentially a 24-hour trip. But that is, as I say, that's unusual, so that, you know, any more domestic travel on weekends is a red flag of fraud. Absence of receipts or documentation, so that we talked about photocopies, the complete absence of receipts. And this, again, this is an occurrence that you'll find in organizations where the managers responsible for reviewing and approving expense reimbursement claims for their subordinates are pressed for time and simply don't have adequate time to scrutinize all of the paperwork involved that's coming across their desk. So they won't notice that a receipt is missing. There'll be a claim for it on the claim form for X number of dollars with a required description of the expense, but they'll know there won't be a receipt. But the fraudster, the dishonest employee, is counting on that manager simply overlooking the absence of that paperwork. Rounded or even numbers on receipts often are indicators that a travel-related expense has been rounded up fraudulently, and may not be a huge amount of money, but it is a windfall nonetheless for the perpetrator. Excessive number of expenses that are just below the receipt level. So sometimes expenses that are incurred on business trips do not have to be show receipts if they're below like $10, $20, whatever it is. But if there's an excessive number of such expenses, of low-dollar expenses, where no receipt is required, it may be that those expenses are totally unrelated to the business trip that is being conducted. Purchasing gift cards with P cards should never be allowed. If it does happen, it's a major red flag that those gift cards are being used for personal benefit. Duplicate vendors and amounts on P card statements, that is a red flag that employees with P cards are splitting purchases to avoid having to obtain specific authorization for an amount over a certain dollar amount. Expenses generated by employees essentially who don't need to have P cards. Typically, especially in large organizations, it is pretty clear as to which type of job descriptions an employee would have to entitle them to have a P card. Sometimes there will be a collusive arrangement, however, between employees who do not fit that description and the administrator in charge of running the P card program, where a P card will be issued to the unqualifying employee, and expenses generated will be reimbursed, and the windfall shared with the two. Arriving a day early and staying a day late. I alluded to that earlier. So if somebody is traveling to a beach town in Florida for legitimate business, and the last meeting is on a Friday. It's awfully tempting to tack on a Saturday and a Sunday to that trip, and again, convince oneself that they are indeed entitled to that. So the key here now is we now know what the red flags look like, the soft behavioral indicators and the more tangible ones. The important question now is how do we find them? How do we detect them? Surprise audits is one way. Employee hotlines, as I mentioned at the beginning, is another way. Once you train your employees in what the red flags look like, you want to have available to them a hotline or ethics line or tip line or whatever you want to call it available to them, whether it's a dedicated text number, a dedicated 800 number, a dedicated website, whatever it is. You want to encourage employees to come forward with tips about suspicious activity in the T&E area. Surveillance is not so much of a T&E fraud necessity. It's more really of a internal mailroom type thing where shenanigans go on there with stealing mail and particularly checks that are on their way out. But, you never know. If somebody is believed to be committing common types of meal frauds, for example, and they're used to falsifying the documentations on their claim forms at their desk, it may pay to install a closed circuit system to see what's really going on. Regular internal audits. So not everybody does regular internal audits, but even if they don't, it would be helpful to implement some form of review, financial review, to determine the effectiveness of your T&E anti-fraud controls, as well as to look specifically and proactively for red flags of the types of T&E fraud that we've discussed today. And that can be done extremely efficiently through the automation, as I mentioned earlier, the automation to detect anomalies and patterns. For example, if somebody is taking an unusually large number of trips to a specific location that happens to be a resort location, are those really all legitimate business trips? Well, this automated software can be programmed to tell you that that there is an unusually large number of trips being taken by a specific employee to a specific destination. It can also tell you that an employee is booking business, so-called business travel on a weekend, and that would that would tell you that there is reason to do additional research on what the activity really is that's going on. Some of these products include IDEA, ACL, and an add-on for Excel called Active Data. I have no direct or indirect affiliation with those, but they are hugely powerful and basically user-friendly tools that you want to use, not just in T&E, but in others as well. Specifically, you want to have this software review claims that were modified, and it can be, one second, get the dog. Sorry about that. The mascot is making trouble for us. Reviewing claims that were modified, reviewing for claims that were corrected. Any expense forms or paperwork that appear to have corrections, whited out or typed over or that kind of thing, this software will find that stuff and it could, because it is unusual that should happen. It's not in accordance with company policy. The same with approved travel dates. So like in the case of Jim, where we had an approved travel itinerary for specific dates that Jim was going to be on a business trip, but he never went. So that is, again, something that can be found even if somebody doesn't happen to notice them in town when they're not supposed to be in town. That can be found through automated auditing as well. Audit for unusual patterns in business meals, air travel, lodging expenses. The bottom line here is you can have any potentially fraudulent anomaly in patterns of travel and entertainment, or patterns of apparently violating policy, travel policy, detected by this powerful software, and it saves a ton of time over reviewing documentation in the T&E space by manual means. Now this takes us to the concluding portion of our presentation here today. How do you prevent T&E fraud controls, T&E frauds? Now, I wish I could tell you that there was a one-size-fits-all magical fraud prevention protocol to apply to T&E, and you would never have another T&E fraud as far as you could imagine. That is unfortunately not possible. The good news, however, is that over the last number of years or so, because fraud of all kinds has increased in frequency and dollar loss amounts, there has been increased attention to it on the part of anti-fraud professionals, many of which are members of the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners, and they have come up with useful best practices in fraud prevention for key areas in the fraud world, T&E being one, and others that the ACFE, of those 65 other types of fraud that the ACFE follows, being included as well. But concern ourselves here with T&E. In terms of best practices, one of the things you want to do, and some of these may already be in your policies, and that's in your travel and entertainment policies, which is great. The challenge there, of course, is who's responsible for enforcing those policies. Requiring traveling employees to submit actual boarding passes on air travel, along with their credit card statements. You do not want employees to be filing for reimbursement of air travel without a original boarding pass. You also do not want to accept, or at least you want to carefully question, if somebody submits a photocopy of a boarding pass. And then as far as the code of conduct, which is sometimes synonymous with a T&E policy, these components that I'm going to just quickly go through with you are not meant to necessarily prevent all T&E frauds, but if they are consistently and effectively enforced, they will collectively serve to deter a lot of frauds that might otherwise be carried out. In other words, most of the people in your organization are honest. There's a small minority who are going to try to commit fraud of various kinds at any given opportunity. Then there's a bunch of people amongst the honest ones who, you know, sometimes get into trouble, like our friend who got into trouble with medical expenses and that sort of thing, who, despite their fundamental honesty, are, you know, sitting on the fence as to whether they should actually commit a fraud because they have no choice. Some of them will be deterred against doing that by this collection of code of conduct policies, and some won't. But it's better to have one in place than not. So personal expenditures are strictly prohibited. So in other words, you can't have a meal with your brother across the country and charge it to the company. It's just, that's not allowed. Only authorized personnel can approve expense reports. You should never delegate this responsibility. It's usually, as you probably already know, the case that in most organizations, the person who is traveling, an employee who is traveling for whatever reason, their immediate supervisor, who is typically the one who's going to be responsible for reviewing and approving your expense reimbursement claims, is really the only one who knows whether these are legitimate expenses or not, whether this employee should have been on this business trip to begin with or not. If you delegate this to somebody who has no clue what this employee's responsibility or job description are, you're asking for trouble. All T&E related purchases should be properly documented in accordance with your policies, and altered documentation should never be allowed. All purchase limits must be adhered to, and splitting of transactions, as I discussed earlier, is in all cases strictly prohibited. You want to prohibit upfront management authorization of T&E expenses, because that, if you do allow that, it opens the opportunity and temptation for a manager and an employee who works for him or her to set up a collusive arrangement where the employee falsifies documentation, receipts, and other documentation. The manager approves that, and the ill-gotten gains from that are then split between the two. No cash advances. That, again, is a company by organization preference. Used to be pretty common. Nowadays, because people don't use cash as much as they use debit cards, it's not that crucial an issue. Establish and enforce a minimum dollar level for requiring receipts. It used to be $25. Some organizations, again, this is where it will vary from one organization to the next. You may put it down to $5, since it's now common and perfectly regular thing for business and or consumer credit and debit card transactions to be as little as less than $1. You may want to reduce it to a lower amount. Require expense reports to have detailed descriptions of the business purpose. So most companies already require an employee to justify a business lunch, saying who it was, where it was, what project it specifically was related to. Some organizations, and I tend to agree with this, require also that employees describe what the next step is after this business event, this business lunch or business dinner. Where will this business expense lead to? Will it lead to the commencement of negotiations on a contract? Will it lead to continued negotiations on a contract? Will it lead to closing of a contract? Whatever it may be, or something completely unrelated, the employee who is trying to expense meals and so forth that are personal in nature is probably going to be deterred or reluctant to make up stuff like that in order to get paid monies that they don't deserve. Consider making expense account approvers understand that they're responsible for any fraud that does occur. So this is a bit of a controversial one. Not a whole lot of organizations use it, but I included it here because some do, and it could be very effective, though it could be penalizing. So if somebody who is required to pay out of their own pocket for frauds that their employees committed and that they, the approvers, missed, are going to be pretty disheartened by being required to do that. So most organizations won't require that, but it's something to consider. and then enforcing anti-fraud policy by providing consequences. There should be distinct and clear consequences as part of whatever training employees are given as to what is going to happen if you do break the rules on T&E policy. Will it be a reprimand? Will it be, a suspension? Will it be termination? Whatever. Or will it be prosecution?